As a part of the story of the kidnappings of Greek and Persian women at the beginning of Book 1, Herodotus narrates in brief the famous episode that was purportedly the cause of the Trojan War, namely the abduction of Helen from her home in Sparta by Paris, the Prince of Troy. The Greeks initially sent an embassy to Troy to ask for her return, but since they themselves had been responsible for earlier kidnappings, their request is disdainfully denied. The Persian perspective on this is interesting. They regard the whole thing as a fairly minor matter. Their assumption is that in these episodes, the women themselves are always in some way more or less complicit. Given this, it was best for the injured party just to swallow his pride and ignore the matter. The Trojans were thus astonished that the Greeks formed a coalition and mounted a major expedition just for the sake of getting back a single woman. There's much more that can be said about this issue, but suffice it to say that these stories present us with a world in which women are generally regarded not as individual subjects, but as property. And like other objects that one can own, they can be stolen. The status of even the highest ranking noblewomen was only just above that of a slave. Another important motif that we have here at the outset is the rivalry between Asia and Europe, as represented by the Persians and the Greeks. This is a major issue that in many ways defines Western historiography. One way in which we understand and define ourselves is always in contrast to someone else. To know who we are, we must know who we are not. We saw this in Homer and Gilgamesh, when civilized life was constantly being compared to uncivilized life. With Herodotus, we see a similar dynamic, but now the opposite term of comparison is not nature as such, or a lack of civilization. On the contrary, the Persians had a highly developed culture. Now the other must be defined in terms of specific cultural qualities that make them different, or, as is often implied, inferior. The Greeks' regular contact with the Persians made them the prototypical other. It was thus natural that the Greeks regularly compared themselves to them. The very distinction between the Greeks and the barbarians that appears at the outset of the work immediately signals the decisive categories of the work, us and them. In the eyes of Herodotus, the Greeks and the Persians represent two entirely different worldviews and ways of life. They have different values, ethics, and political constructions. The Greeks celebrate freedom, equality, and constitutionalism, whereas the Persians are slaves to whimsical and tyrannical kings. The contrast of civilizations is one of the main themes of the work. This complex relation between the Greeks and the Persians was the beginning of a long story that's still with us today. The rivalry between Asia and Europe, the Orient and the Occident, East and West. After Herodotus' time, Alexander the Great conquered Persia. Then it was made into a Roman province. In the Middle Ages, after the rise of Islam, it was the object of waves of European armies on so-called crusades to the Holy Land. Europe fended off incursions from the Muslims at both ends of its territory, with Spain in the west being occupied by the Umayyads from the 8th century until the fall of the Emirate of Granada in 1492. Then, in the east, the Ottoman Empire conquered and occupied many areas in Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, including the Balkans, Bulgaria, and Hungary. The Ottoman Wars lasted for centuries, and the occupation was only ultimately overthrown and driven out in 1699. In the 18th and 19th century, the East was colonized by European powers with, for example, British India and the Dutch East Indies. The infamous Greco-Turkish War took place from 1919 to 1922, which included atrocities on both sides. To this very day, despite the development of globalization, Europe and the West still regard Asia at best as something radically different and other, and at worst as something sinister and threatening. The story that Herodotus recounts was the beginning of this long narrative, which has shaped the self-image of Europe and the Western world. Together with Homer, Herodotus initiated the tradition of pejorative Western characterizations of Asia that Edward Said refers to critically as Orientalism.